When I write a story about a historical event, I try to be as accurate as I possibly can. Of course, we all make mistakes. This is not a historical event. This is an incident that happened in my life. And it is written as accurately and truthful as I can write a story. The title of the story is The Tales of Wags. As you age, you look back and remember a few defining moments of your childhood. Most likely some, if not most of them, will be the warmth, love, and compassion bestowed upon you by your parents. I believe that in these tender moments we learn compassion, we learn love and care. You see, I don't believe that these emotions are born of human instinct. I believe they're learned through experience and exposure. This is why I think mankind has not only endured, but for the most part has thrived. This story is about one of those defining occurrences that influenced my life and my mother's. It could be said that I was a healthy child, with one exception. About twice a year I would get severe acute tonsillitis, usually in the wintertime, and it would last for several days. I would run a high fever and my throat would swell to almost closing. The pain was excruciating. Doctors had recommended that I have my tonsils removed, but my parents had a friend whose child died having a tonsillectomy, so that was not an option for me. Eventually, when I was grown, I had that operation. But in the meantime, the cure was to stay indoors and have my throat swabbed with a red medicine that smelled like, and probably was, either methylate or mercurochrome. This story starts when I was in the second grade and just coincidentally had made my first visit to the bookmobile that came twice a month to my rural school. I checked out a book named Wags and Woofy. The next day, the dreaded tonsillitis made its appearance. It began with a slight sore throat, then chills, followed by a high fever, and then a worsening sore throat. Strangely, I look back fondly on those sick days because of the tender care my mother gave me. I especially remember the times when I was sick and she would read to me. We lived in a frame house my daddy started building soon after World War II and before I was born. When I was very small, we moved in. It was by no means completed and would not be for another 9 years. But the design was large and there was enough modestly finished area to house a family of 5. When I say my dad built the house, I mean every word of it. He often demolished other homes to get the lumber, nailed every nail, and laid every brick. One thing he did not do was add insulation. Thus, the house was drafty and uncomfortably cold in the wintertime. In one room, which we called the den, was a space heater. It was the only heated room in the house except the kitchen, where Mother prepared 3 full meals a day. In the den was a small couch, and on this couch, in front of the space heater, was where I would stay when I was sick. My mother was an excellent reader, and when I was ill, she would cover me with a blanket, turn up the heater, and read to me. When she read, she would make it sound so interesting. It could be a newspaper article, a recipe, or an advertisement, but she knew how to give it just the perfect voice inflections and facial expressions to make the story come alive. Under these circumstances, and during this bout with tonsillitis, she read me the story of Wags and Woofy, a book that would certainly influence both of our lives. The book was actually a child's story about 2 puppies that were raised on a farm. Woofy was the alpha dog and the leading character in the book, and Wags was his playful, shyer sibling. Mother always pulled for the underdog in all situations, and I'm sure she took some liberties in reading to give Wags a more winning personality than perhaps the writer had intended. With my head in Mom's lap, covered with a blanket to ward off the cold draught, my fever raged. But I remember much of the story and the illustrations that were in that book to this very day. I don't remember much about Woofy, but I remember Wags because Mother felt sorry for him. I also wanted a puppy, and I wanted him to be just like Wags. Our neighbor, Corbett Timms, raised dogs. Not that he liked dogs, but he used them for hunting. And hunting was a major means of feeding his family. He had 2 types, hounds for raccoons and rabbits, and a smaller breed for squirrel hunting. They were called feist dogs. One of his feist dogs had a litter of puppies. I was attracted to the one of the puppies, not the biggest one and not the runt, but the one that was a dirty white color. I wanted that dog. I told Mr. Timms that I would give him $1 for it. I did not have $1. In fact, I did not have 25 cents. A few days later, I upped the offer to $2 and finally $3. He told me he would think about it. I took that to mean that he would sell me the dog, and I began to do some financial planning. I would skip lunch at school and save the 15 cents every day. Finally, with money in hand, I went to see Mr. Corbett Timms. I gave him the money, and he gave me the dog. As I thanked him and started home with the dog in hand, he handed back the money to me and said, "You can have the dog. Just give him a good home. He's a smart one." All of these negotiations had been done without my parents' knowledge or approval, and my presentation of a puppy did not in any way thrill my mother. Mother was a frugal woman because she had to be. We always ate leftovers the next day. A couple of days after that, we ate leftovers. Finally, anything that remained was combined into a stew, a soup, or casserole. There were no scraps that could be sacrificed for a dog, and buying dog food was simply out of the question. Looking back, I guess her heart softened when I told her his name was Wags. She smiled, patted him on the head, and agreed that I could keep him. She remembered the story she had read to me. Wags and I were inseparable in the daylight hours. When bedtime came, he slept outside in the pump house. No dogs were allowed in our house, but on real cold nights, I would sneak him inside and put him under the blanket. If Mother ever knew this, she never let on, but it did not happen often. My mother was not only frugal, she was industrious. Each year she made 2 gardens, one on the hill between our house and the barn, and the other in the lowland to the south of our house. Her reasoning was that if nature caused one to fail, the other would produce enough food so that her family would have plenty to eat. The garden in the lowland was the more fertile, as prior to the highway being built, it would flood from the high water of Big Creek. This deposited silt that made for perfect gardening, but it also encouraged undergrowth that had to be hoed often. It also held more moisture. As strong as my mother was, she did have some fears. She was frightened by the very thought of a snake. Unfortunately, we were cursed with lots of them. The garden on the hill tended to attract what was called ground rattlers. They were a small snake related to the rattlesnake family that possessed a mild but painful venom. The garden in the lowland, however, attracted cottonmouth moccasins and copperheads. Both of these species were highly venomous and could threaten human life if not treated. Thank goodness they were not as plentiful as the ground rattlers. I suppose Mother's weakness, her fear of snakes, was Wags' strength. He hated snakes too, but he had no fear of them. He was quick and smart, and he knew how to attack them. With a few shakes of his head, he would render them dead. Early in the morning, Mother would pick up her garden basket and say, "Come on, Wags, let's go." I know without a doubt, Wags knew this was his duty. Some dogs may herd cattle, some may pull sleds, but Wags' sole purpose then was to be with my mother and seek and destroy the serpent. As time passed, he and I could be playing, but when he saw the basket in Mother's hands, he knew it was time to go to work. Wags would go to the garden, a row in front of Mother, searching both right and left. If he spotted a snake, he would give a certain shrill, sharp bark. It would be followed by a lightning-fast attack, and soon a lifeless snake would be laid at my mother's feet. Of course, he got the typical doggy pat on the head with a reassuring "good boy" from Mother. Then off he would go again. Like all living things, Wags loved to be needed, and Mother needed him. Over the next few years, their relationship grew into one of closeness and respect. I noticed an extra piece of bacon in the skillet on most mornings, and that was for Wags. Wags was not always perfect in his attack. One day he was bitten on the nose by a ground rattler. His head began to swell and his eyes began to close. Archie, the black man that plowed our garden with his mule Fred, told Mother to feed him some sardines. He said the oil in the sardines would sop up the poison. It seemed to work, and in a few days, Wags was back at work on his mission of seek and destroy. More bites would occur, and it seemed that Wags had built up an immunity. His face would swell, but not as much as it did at first. It happened so often that he began to lose the hair on his nose and face. By the end of the 3rd year, he was completely hairless on his face. He became known as the case's bald-headed dog. One year when Wags was about 5 years old, Mother was gathering in the lower garden. She heard his familiar shrill bark, and then she heard a long whine. She had never heard that noise before. Wags did not bring the snake to her. When Mother approached, she saw a large dead copperhead. She also saw Wags. He was beginning to have convulsions. Mother dumped the contents of her garden basket in the middle of the row and scooped Wags up, and put him in the basket, and started to the house. Archie did not live far away, and she drove up and told him what had happened. He went into a shed and came back with 2 jars of liquid and something wrapped in a newspaper. He rode to our house with Mother. Wags was near death. His body was twitching uncontrollably. His face was so swollen you could not even see his eyes, and his tongue was swelling. With the expertise of a physician, Archie opened the first jar of liquid. "This be colloid, Miss Eunice. We start with that." He rubbed the colloid in the 2 vein marks and then squeezed the wounds as if to drain the poison. He then had Mother heat some water. He applied hot compresses to the area for what seemed like an hour. Next, he applied more colloid. In a few minutes, he opened the other bottle. "This be turpentine, Miss Eunice. Your dog be plenty hurt." Finally, he opened the newspaper. "This here be cobwebs. They be almost like magic. They suck up that poison." I knew cobwebs were spider webs, and I'd heard they could stop bleeding. I had no idea they were good for snake bites, but Archie seemed to know what he was doing. "Miss Eunice, your dog may not make it, but I done all I can do. He be too sick to eat, but pour that sardine oil down his mouth if you can." Archie was right. Wags almost didn't make it, but finally he turned the corner, and in about 3 weeks it was as good as new. If Wags had hated snakes before, the bite reinforced his dislike. Instead of just going up a row looking on each side, he would go all over the garden. It seems he wanted to get even with every cottonmouth or copperhead he could find. There were more bites, and he got sick, but never as bad as the first time, and never was his life threatened. He was a well-tuned snake-killing machine, and he was my mother's companion and protector. Epilogue. Everyone dreads that phone call in the early morning hours, or even more so a knock on the door. On a very cold winter night, when Wags was about 7 years old, that knock came. When we went to the door, our neighbor and good friend Tommy held Wags in his arms. He had been hit by a car on the highway. He was alive but unresponsive. The only wound appeared to be a cut over his right eye. Mother turned on the heater and warmed a blanket. Wags was asleep inside with Mother's blessings that night. The next day was Saturday, and just as Mother had comforted me with my head in her lap, she did the same thing for Wags. That night she checked on him at least every hour, and there was no improvement. The next day, Sunday, we went to church. When we came home, Wags had passed. We buried him in the high garden, and Mother never planted near his grave as long as she gardened. In fact, she never gardened amongst the cottonmouths and copperheads again. All this happened some 55 years ago. I'll probably drive home and read this story to Mom. She's now 102 years old, but she'll still remember it. Better yet, I think I'll let her read it to me. She can do a better job than I can.